Bangladesh's former Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina has been sentenced to death for ordering the crackdown on last year's student-led uprising. 1,400 people were killed. But Hasina is in exile in India. So what are the chances she'll face justice back home? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Adrian Finighan. Biased and politically motivated. That's how the former Prime Minister of Bangladesh has described her conviction for crimes against humanity. Sheikh Hasina has rejected the death sentence handed down by the War Crimes Tribunal that she created in 2010. It's in relation to her government's violent crackdown on the 2024 student-led protests that culminated in her ousting. The court found that Hasina had masterminded the security response, ordering the use of helicopters, drones and live fire on the crowds. She was tried in absentia because she's been living in exile in India since she fled the country. Bangladesh's interim leader has promised to ensure that she faces justice. So, will India comply with demands for Hasina's extradition? And if it refuses, how will that shape relations between Dhaka and New Delhi? We'll put those questions to our guests. But first, a report from Alexandra Byers.
More than 1,400 people were killed and tens of thousands injured during the student-led uprising in Bangladesh last year. Drones and helicopters were unleashed on civilians. Security forces shot teenagers in the head, while others were nearly blinded by shotgun pellets.
We were ordinary people who demanded nothing unjust. We were protesting for a just cause, but the government tried to brutally suppress our movement.
The country's War Crimes Tribunal has convicted then Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina of crimes against humanity for ordering the brutal crackdown and sentenced her to death for being directly responsible for a systematic attack that led to mass killings. Hasina was tried in absentia. She's living in exile in India. She says the verdict is biased and politically motivated and maintains she acted in good faith. The unrest began in June 2024 when students organized mass protests against a long-standing quota system that reserved 30% of public service jobs for descendants of war veterans. They said it was unfair and favored the governing party. By mid-July, it had become a mass uprising against authoritarianism, economic woes, and rights abuses, and the government launched a brutal crackdown. But it failed, and in early August, Hasina resigned and fled the country. A fall from grace for the woman known as the Iron Lady of Bangladesh and the daughter of the man considered its founding father. During her 15 years in office, supporters credited Hasina with the rapid growth and development of the economy. But for many others, it was a reign of terror, with rights groups and the UN documenting torture and forced disappearances. Now she's a convicted war criminal, but questions remain over how the sentence will be carried out. The Indian government has ignored requests for her extradition. Her son says she's determined to fight. But in Bangladesh, there are hundreds of families who've lost their sons in the violence she orchestrated. And they're waiting, determined she will be forced to face justice one day. Alexandra Byers, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Let's bring in our guests. From the capital of Bangladesh, Dhaka, we're joined by Sohela Nazneen, Senior Research Fellow at the Institute of Development Studies. Sreeradha Datta is a professor at OP Jindal Global University, who focuses on South Asia. She joins us from New Delhi. And in Oxford in the UK is Takbir Huda, a human rights lawyer and Clarendon Scholar in Oxford University. Sohela, let's start with you. What is the mood there tonight in Dhaka? Is there a sense that justice has been done?
The mood tonight in Dhaka, I mean, the streets of Dhaka, apart from where the court is, was a little bit empty because people were worried about disruption and safety issues because there has been violence last evening. But people in the court, those who were listening to the verdict, they were cheering after the verdict was delivered. I think the mood is partly tense in terms of people are worried about what will happen, but at the same time, the demand for justice has been widely shared by the public, and people have been waiting for this day to see what will happen. So there we are. It's kind of a little bit of fear, but at the same time, a feeling of that there is some resolution.
Sreeradha, Datta, Professor, what do you make of the verdicts handed down to Hasina? What is the likelihood of her ever being extradited from India? To what extent does the death penalty in particular put India in a difficult position right now?
It certainly has, but as we know, India considers the former Prime Minister as a guest here. So I don't think the government is going to likely to respect the request which has come in from the interim just now post the verdict. They, of course, as we know, despite the fact that the two neighbors have an extradition treaty in place, it's a much more complicated and complex issue. It's not as simple as that just because the extradition treaty exists. The minute you have a request in place, she will be sent over. So it's not as easy as that. There is certainly a legal team which will, look into all the details and the process, of course. But I would think the mood, let's leave the legal and the complexities away. The political environment in India is such that they don't think that she is, she's always been treated like a guest and not a refute. So I don't think, until Sheikh Hasina herself wants to go back, India is unlikely to hand her over to Bangladesh or the interim government or any other government.
OK, we'll explore that in a little more detail as our discussion progresses. Takbir, as a human rights lawyer, what do you make of the verdicts? To what extent do you think that the handing down of the death penalty in particular was perhaps a strategic mistake by Bangladesh?
Thank you. So, yes, in fact, it was, I think, a massive strategic mistake because, and before I say why, we must ask, what kind of justice do Bangladeshis actually want to see? If the goal was simply to bar Hasina from returning to Bangladesh in the immediate future and, pass a very symbolic death sentence that will, almost entirely never be possible to carry out, then one could say that the verdict does just that. But if the vision for justice is slightly more ambitious, and if it is more encompassing, then the death penalty, I think, was counterproductive. Because if the vision for justice was that to Sheikh Hasina would actually be returned to Bangladesh or face a real, physically brought before a court to be held to account, then the death penalty minimizes or absolutely, essentially nullifies the chances of that ever happening. Because we know that not only will India not send Hasina back to Bangladesh when she's likely to face execution, but international institutions like the UN and the ICC and other Western states who would typically be supportive of such efforts would also take a back step when they know that the death penalty is on the table. And for that reason, it is sort of counterproductive per my estimation, because, the death penalty essentially, I think, really reduces any chances of international cooperation and also cooperation from India's side, both of which are essential to, ensure that Sheikh Hasina actually faces some level of accountability that is more than merely expressive or symbolic.
OK, we'll come back to that in just a few moments, Takbir. Sohela, Hasina says that she wasn't given a fair chance to defend herself. In court, she claimed that she'd only acted in good faith to bring disorder under control. The verdict, she said, had been made by a rigged tribunal established and presided over by an unelected government with no democratic mandate. Was the case against her a politically motivated charade, as she has argued, or is the country in little doubt that the proceedings against her were fair and that she was indeed guilty of the charges that were brought against her?
Adrian, I'm not a lawyer, so I can't talk about legal technicalities and due process issues. But what I can definitely say that as Bangladeshis who have gone through July last year and remember what happened, we all remember the kind of repression that was going on. But apart from that, if you think about the investigative reports that have come out, that have been carried out by international media, and also UN UN team's investigation report that systematically documents what has happened. There have been evidence of leaked audio calls between the former prime minister, talking about use of lethal weapons, use of helicopters to shoot people, conversation between the former home minister and the police officer about the police officer saying how that if he shoots one protester, one dies, but others don't move, like that kind of conversation. And that has been verified independently, that these are not made up audio tapes. It's a little bit difficult to refute. I mean, I would presume. So as a general citizen who's observing the process, and in a sense, you would, you can talk about how speedily this was done. There are different issues, but that doesn't deflect from the fact that 1,400 people died and many, many injured, and Sheikh Hasina was in power and bears command responsibility.
Professor Datta, how will India giving refuge to Hasina now strain an already strained relationship between Dhaka and New Delhi? How do you see it affecting relations in the future? Or do you think that both sides, Bangladesh and India, will take a more pragmatic view of this situation?
Yes, as we see just now, the bilateral ties are at a pretty fragile state with interim and New Delhi at this point of time. So let's look at a scenario once elections are held. An elected government takes over and they repeat the request, which I guess will happen. So even under those circumstances, I very much doubt that Government of India is going to change its position. And there is going to be, I think both, and it's something that's been said on both sides in India as well in Bangladesh, that they're important neighbors for each other. So to put all the bilateral relation on hold just because of this particular case, I think would, be inopportune. I think both the nations have worked together to put cross-border, facilities in place. They built a really robust trade system and many other, cross-sectoral work that was going on, partnership that had developed. So I hope and I really wish to see a situation where they will put this aside. And as I said, it's unlikely that India is going to move from its erstwhile position on this particular issue. And I think the elected government also would probably not make this the only kind of this of nothing else kind of a scenario. So I do hope that we'll see pragmatism in today's global mix. We see the kind of fluidity that occurs on a regular basis because of the situations changing constantly. So I do hope that South Asia definitely needs these two neighbors to work together, not only just for themselves, but also for the betterment of the region. So I hope that they can keep this particular issue aside and, let it not maybe as business as always, but certainly better than what we just see now, where it's a bare minimum, bilateral contact point that we maintain with each other.
Takbir, the use of the International Crimes Tribunal to try Hasina has been criticised by human rights groups. Human Rights Watch says that despite some changes, it still falls short of fair trial standards and safeguards while retaining the right to pass down the death penalty. What do you make, as a human rights lawyer, of that criticism? What should Bangladesh actually have done if it wants Hasina to face genuine accountability?
Right. So, Look, there's no denying that these international crimes tribunals were set up by Hasina herself to eradicate her political opposition. And, certain leaders were also executed through, kangaroo trials. So there's a certain level of irony and circularity here that now the master's tools are being used against her. But as we know from Audre Lorde, that the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. So that is the grounds on which there is for trials concerns about these tribunals, which have for the past decade and a half been used to eradicate political opposition. Now, the interim government did introduce some progressive, amendments to bring it more in line with the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, but it perhaps, observers have said it's not gone far enough because you can't deny the fact that it is still a domestic tribunal. You can't ignore the fact that there were 54 prosecution witnesses, but not one single defense witness. You can't ignore the fact that the defense lawyer that was engaged was, representing defendants who are in absentia. He did not have access to his clients, and he was paid for by the same government, who at many occasions have shown that guilt was, somehow predetermined. Now, I'm not saying that there isn't compelling evidence that suggests Sheikh Hasina was guilty. Of course there is, but there is a way to establish that guilt through a process which, meets the standards of fair trial guarantees under international human rights law and international criminal law. So here, Bangladesh could really have taken seriously the option to refer this case to the ICC. To my knowledge, they have not explored that option to the extent that they could have. Another option would have been to, solicit a technical and financial assistance from the UN and the ICC and any other international organization / partner, diplomatic partner, which would have been willing to contribute to a hybrid tribunal, as we've seen set up in Lebanon and Sierra Leone. And that would have given it a lot more international legitimacy because there would have been international oversight. But I do not think either of these options were pursued. Instead, it was a pretty tunnel vision that the ICT that the Hasina had used against her political opposition would now be used against her. And it's not, so Bangladesh doesn't just owe fair trial rights to Sheikh Hasina because she is a defendant under law who is entitled to these protections, but the 1,400 or so victims of the massacre, who were killed. Also, it's a debt we owe to them because we owe them, justice that is handed out through a fair, transparent process which cannot be questioned. And sadly, the trial does not reach that standard.
Sohela, I want to pick up on something that you said in your first answer when you mentioned that people were, I forget the form of words that you used, apprehensive, nervous, perhaps even afraid of what might happen in the future. Hasina's son told the Reuters news agency that though his mother would remain safe in Delhi, she would not sit back quietly. She's upset, angry and outraged, he's reported to have said, and we're all determined to fight back by whatever means necessary. With her Awami League party banned from participating in February's election and vowing to cause mass unrest, I mean, just how concerned should not just the interim government be, but the people of Bangladesh, as you say, do they fear further unrest?
Well, Dhaka is currently under tight security, and today, initially, you didn't see a lot of traffic on the streets. That should tell you that, of course, there's a lot of apprehension. There are other verdicts coming up, and then you have elections. If Awami League is not participating in elections, then obviously, if you look at the electoral data from previous years, you'll see it at least got 30% votes when elections were free and fair, right? I'm discounting 2008 elections. So it's not that it doesn't have a support base. So that does mean that the verdict that has come through today and then the other cases that we are expecting verdicts on is going to create, threats will be present, and Awami League has issued threats in a sense that there will be disruptions, there will be lockdowns, there will be violence. And Bangladesh's politics has been quite violent. So yes, there is apprehension. So the question for the interim government, but also the government that will come through elections, would be then how does it create a stable environment, and how do we move forward? Can we move forward from this verdict? Should Awami League be focusing on one person or the political family, or should it be thinking about a different kind of politics, right? Because, it does have a significant support base. People will not. They are citizens of this country, but then how do you move forward and how do you have reconciliation while you also ensure that there is not a culture of impunity and nobody will repeat what has happened last year?
Professor, what do you make of that? To what extent will this trial and verdict shape politics, not just in Bangladesh, but in India too, and the wider region?
So far as Bangladesh is concerned, I think, we've also seen in the past when some political parties were not part of the general election, there was noise and fervor for a bit, but then things cooled down and it's business as usual mode. So here again, at this point of time, what we understand is there's a ban on political activity of Awami League. So we don't think at this point that by February, if elections are held as per schedule, that Awami League is going to be part of it. So they would need to accept that, internalize that. Of course, we've seen Hasina has been inciting violence, has been asking her workers to ensure there's a national lockdown kind of a situation. So all that is likely, and administration, I'm sure, is fully aware of it. And, as we've just heard, the streets of Dhaka look bare today because people are apprehensive, security forces are out there. So they will have to manage that system. Suppose we see an election where Awami League is not participating. But again, the point made that Awami League is really one of the largest political party, the oldest political party. So they certainly do have the political presence in the nation. It's not that they don't have. Right now, there is anger with the leadership issue. So I think that is another aspect. And a best case scenario, as I see it, would be if the, Sheikh Hasina steps down, somebody else takes over, and they kind of rebuild the image of Awami League, because what they've done for 15 years is certainly unacceptable for most. And another point about elections I just wanted to make, I was there in Dhaka in January 24 when elections happened under the last election of Sheikh Hasina. And I saw the very, very low, limited turnout that happened within Dhaka. I visited almost every booth possible. So even when it was Awami League, under the Awami League regime, elections were held, Awami Leaguers themselves were not out on the road to vote for Awami League themselves. So clearly there was disillusionment about the democratic process. There was lack of accountability. There was zero transparency. So those problems are quite evident even then. So to expect that people are going to forget what has happened, yes, of course, Awami League has a historical presence. But again, there's transgressions are very, very obvious, and there's been enough evidence about that. So I would say at this point of time, while they might create mayhem, they will create mayhem, they will create chaos. But I think it's up to the administration and up to people to be firm, stand in there, and it has to kind of roll down the road, make amends some way or the other, and hopefully in another few years' time we'll see that they're also part of the electoral process, and things will go on in a far more positive, robust way, not the kind of bipartisan politics that we've always seen in Bangladesh. I really hope that would break down at this point of time.
All right. Takbir, of course, there were protests after the verdict today. What do today's verdicts mean for the younger generation in Bangladesh and across the region?
Look, there is a younger generation that is highly retributivist and highly populist in its sentiment as to, what should happen as a result of what unfolded in July last year. They're they're rejoicing. But there's also a young generation which wanted a more reconciliatory approach in line with the transitional justice framework of the UN, where pure retribution is never the path to healing. So I think they are slightly more skeptical, and they realize that the effect of the death penalty is not only that Sheikh Hasina is likely never going to be sent back to Bangladesh, but it creates ruptures in society, which we've seen, as we were just hearing Awami League is one of the largest political parties in Bangladesh. And before this death sentence incensed, their supporters, there were a series of authoritarian measures taken against Awami League as a political entity, which, basically, it was called a temporary suspension, but in its effect, it is a ban, which exceeded, or violated the guarantees under International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, to which Bangladesh is a state party. So you can't wipe out you can't eradicate a political party which has been foundational to Bangladesh's history and has such a large voter base. The way that politics works in Bangladesh, or dynastic politics works in Bangladesh, its supporters will go to incredible lengths to forgive the sins of its rulers. So Sheikh Hasina may not be in Bangladesh, but thousands, if not millions, who will support Sheikh Hasina to the death are still there, and they will continue to pose a security threat to Bangladesh and its youth if we don't account for a more reconciliatory approach which ensures Bangladesh remains stable rather than descends into a fractured society.
Sohela, we've got about a minute left on the program. What do you make of what Takbir was saying there? What does this verdict mean for the youth of Bangladesh? Is there more hope for them today?
Well, this verdict obviously is a first step, but at the same time, as you heard from the panelists, that there are questions around the process and how it was handled. But Bangladeshis are divided on certain issues. For example, should we have gone to the UN and let ICC handle it? Should it have been domestic? There are also debates around the death penalty. So we will be debating in the future what should have happened. But at the same time, what it also means is that there is an end to impunity. We had a military dictator in 1980s, Ershad, who got reinstated in politics later on, even though we got verdicts against him. So obviously there will be questions around how will you implement what has happened? What will happen in terms of the political entity that Awami League is and its supporters? How do you create a society where you can exist and reconcile? Those questions are not going to go away. But for the Bangladeshi youth that brought down a brutal autocrat, this is still significant. The verdict still has symbolic value, and it does not allow you to deflect from what happens, and that is important.
Okay, there we're going to end it. Many thanks indeed for being with us today on the programme. Sohela, Nazneen, Sreeradha, Datta and Takbir Huda. Thanks for watching. You can see the programme again at any time by going to the website at aljazeera.com. For further discussion, you can join us at our Facebook page at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And of course, you can always join the conversation on X. Our handle there is at AJ Inside Story. From me, Adrian, Finighan and the team here. Thanks for watching. We'll see you again. Bye for now.